has done publicity for us for this event. I also want to thank Mary Bloodworth, who is our tech support for this event, and of course, Judy Berman, the executive director at the Village, who always supports these programs. I want to remind you that this is being recorded, and so please mute yourself. When we get to the question and answer, then we'll ask you to unmute yourself at that time. Before the recording, we'd like you to stay muted during the presentation. If during the presentation you have a question that you just are afraid you're going to forget, use the chat and put the questions in there, and Mary and I will try to watch for those toward the end of the presentation. I also want to mention the upcoming events. Next month, we will have Robin Hinson Jones, who's going to be talking about American diplomacy and how it has changed over the past 50 years and who now represents America abroad. In March, we will have David Ottaway, and he has a new book out on Mohammed bin Salman, which he calls the Icarus of Saudi Arabia. In April, we're going to have Anthony Quinn. I've titled his talk, "Have You Read a Good Book Lately?" because he is a reader of audiobooks for the Library of Congress and for other organizations. And he's going to be talking about the audiobook and how it gets done. In May, then we have Jeffrey Kabasovich, and he's going to be talking about his book on the emergence of the Republican Party and how it has evolved. And then in June, we have Carol Gradzins talking about social entrepreneurship and the Ashoka Initiative. So that's where we're going for this spring season. And I hope you'll join with us for many of them. Now to tonight's program. Dr. Constance Citro, this is her third appearance with us, which makes her the most frequent guest that we have had on Village Voices, and for good reason. She gives wonderful lectures that we all enjoy and learn something from. She first talked to us in 2019 about the upcoming 2020 census. Then she joined us again after the census to talk about what had happened, what had gone right, and what had gone wrong. And now again, she's going to talk to us about the aftermath of a census in the US. And this is particularly important, I think, not only politically, but for those of you who are genealogists, April 1 is the opening of the 1950 census. So if you're all ready to find out more about your family tree, the 1950 census opens April 1 by law. Also, if you have, after this presentation, some thoughts about Elbridge Gerry, Bruce Brennan wants us all to remember that he is buried at Congressional Cemetery. And if you wish to walk past the gravestone and say some words to him, you are welcome to do so. And finally, just a couple of days ago, the New York Times ran a big article on Census Memo Cites Unprecedented Meddling by Trump Officials. And so here we have, again, the census in the news today as we go forward with this redistricting that we all are anticipating. Connie Citro is well known to most of you. She holds a PhD in political science, but she has spent much of her life in the world of statistics and in the world of the census. She is our national treasure. She is our best expert in the country on the census, how it works, how it doesn't, and what it means. We are lucky to have her as a neighbor. And with that, Connie, the Zoom room is yours.
Thank you so very, very much, Trudy. This is just wonderful to be invited back to talk to you all. And I'm going to cover quite a bit of ground here. And I invite you, if you want my slides or have questions afterwards, in addition to the question period, I'm always available. My topic this time is, does gerrymandering threaten our democracy and related features of America's contentious political history? All the features I'm going to talk about relate to the decennial census. And our question now is 2020 up to the job and what's happening? Okay, how about page down here? Well, there we go. All right, our democracy. The US Constitution was a marvel in its day, but it was not then, and it is not now, very democratic in the sense of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Amendments, the Bill of Rights, and suffrage expansion have definitely helped, but there are a lot still of undemocratic features. And one of them is gerrymandering, which is the name given to drawing congressional districts, state legislative districts to partisan advantage using the census, and now voting data are used. Regardless of party, when gerrymandering is explained to the public, they don't like it. It undercuts public trust. And the parties have used it, both parties do it, to gain outsized influence in state legislatures and Congress and to create safe seats. And the problem with safe seats is it means the primary is the important election and not the general election. And it is the base of a party that turns out for a primary. And so the candidates tend to be at the extremes of a party. And this is, again, not good for government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Gerrymandering is actually one of several what I call structural levers that parties have contested over our history to get a leg up in Congress and the states through reapportionment and redistricting, all of which is tied to the census. In some periods, all this has been sort of within normal political jockeying and so on, but there have been periods that have not been at all pretty, and we are in one right now. I hope the nation, all of us, will be roused to action like the progressive movement 100 years ago and the civil rights movement 50, 60 years ago. Okay, I want to start with a map. This is the US in 1790. You can see the original states. The royal blue is the Northwest Territory, which was part of the US, but not organized into states. And then there's a lot of land that's either unclaimed or Spanish at the time or whatever. But it was very clear to the colonists and the new citizens of the new republic that westward expansion, what was later termed manifest destiny, was going to be the order of the day. And there needed to be a mechanism as states were added and the population grew and shifted to reallocate power. Censuses have a long history, but their purpose was things like taxation, military service. We innovated the first constitutionally mandated census to peaceably reapportion power. The census affects the seats in the US House, state legislatures, city councils. Our own ward has just been through or is going through a redistricting process. We grew more than other wards, so we're having to lose some folks to other wards to get equal sized districts. And then the Electoral College, the number of representatives is right up there, plus the senators. But peaceable reallocation of power does not mean without controversy. And in fact, we fought a civil war when everything broke down. I've identified what I call 6 structural levers that have affected seats in the House, the Senate, and state legislatures. 4 of them Congress has directly had a hand in. One is who counts in the census for reapportionment and redistricting. The formula for apportioning seats in the House, the size of the House, which increased from 65 seats in 1789 to our current 435, which was achieved in 1913, and the admission of new states. There were fights in Congress in the 19th century over all of these. And there's still some question, at least in some people's minds, about number one, who counts. The states, according to the Constitution, are in charge of redistricting, but Congress can step in, and that's in the Constitution too. And I've identified two flavors, so to speak: malapportionment, which means having congressional or state legislative districts that are unequal population size, had been a feature until the 1960s court cases of one person, one vote. You can call that actually a form of the broader term of gerrymandering, something that gives a political party an advantage. The popular picture of a gerrymander is a really odd shape. And there's a great quote: "To an untrained eye, the proposed boundaries looks like the etchings of a map maker on heavy pharmaceuticals. In reality, it's a masterpiece of diabolical gerrymandering." And as Trudy referred to, the first gerrymander was a salamander-shaped district in Massachusetts by Governor Elbridge Gerry, 1812. But you can have gerrymandered districts even if they are equal, compact, contiguous, don't look too funny. And I'm going to show you a picture of Austin, Texas about that. Here's the cartoon of the famous salamander gerrymander in 1812. This is northeast of Boston, if you know your political geography there. Here is Austin, Texas, where this set up, this is the map in Texas as of 2013. And this is showing 6 congressional districts. Austin is right there in the center. Austin is a blue part of a red state. But you will see that of these 6 districts, only one of them, the 35th district, is actually held by a Democrat. And that's been true ever since these districts were set up. What the Republican legislature did was to do what is called cracking, which means take the other party's voters and split them up. So Austin was carved up into slices of a pie, and the Democratic voters paired with suburban and rural Republican voters in a way that the Republicans had the edge. So this is a gerrymander. These districts are, yeah, they're not perfectly compact, but they're nothing like that salamander, and yet they are gerrymandered. All right, I'm going to go through these structural levers. They all do relate to the census. Who counts for reapportionment and redistricting? Well, from the beginning, everybody counted except foreign tourists and Indians not taxed was the word. Slaves counted as 3/5 of a person. The 14th Amendment made former slaves US citizens and explicitly repealed the 3/5 clause. American Indians were made citizens in 1924. Now, I'll come back to this one when we get to the 2020 census, because who counts was part of that attempted Trump administration interference with the census. The apportionment formula and the house size. It used to be that every census, Congress would pass a law telling the states what their allocation of seats would be for the House. And there were big fights every decade about this. The formula mattered because we don't have partial Congress people. We don't have people who have like 3/4 of a vote or 1/3 of a vote or something. So after you've divided through the states, you're left with some remaining odd number of seats. And there are different formulas for which states get those seats. Thomas Jefferson had a formula. Daniel Webster had a formula. Alexander had a formula that a Congressman Vinton latched onto. Professor Huntington and a Census Bureau statistician later on, that's Huntington Hill, had a formula. These have all been used at different times in our history. We now use the Huntington Hill formula, and that's been resolved. Also in this bill, the house size after each census would be increased, not just to accommodate any new states, of which there were many in the 19th century, but to ease the pain for the states that would otherwise be losing seats. The consequence is that we went from about 40,000 people per seat in 1790 to a couple 100,000 in 1911 to 760,000 now on average, which is much larger number of people per seat than in any other democracy. Okay, there was a lot of contention over admitting states to the Union. It takes a simple majority according to the Constitution, but there were always fights. And before the Civil War, it was balancing slave and free states. During the Civil War, Nevada was admitted with a very small population, just around 10,000, even though 60,000 was the standard that Congress was using then. And the reason Congress had this information was the census has always covered territories. 2020 covered Puerto Rico and Guam and Samoa and Virgin Islands and so on. After the Civil War, a lot of Western states were admitted. For instance, the Dakota Territory was carved into 2 states instead of 1, and we have a built-in rural malapportionment in the Senate that is with us. Alaska and Hawaii were the last to be admitted. Unfortunately, I don't think DC is likely to become a state anytime soon, because although it takes a simple majority, we have the filibuster in the Senate. Okay, this is the US in 1864. And the kind of pinkish are the Confederate states. The bland cream color are territories that are not yet states. The red states were the states that Lincoln won. And the green is what McClellan on the Democratic ticket won. And you can see Nevada over there. And it was made a state in 1864 in time for that election as one way to boost Lincoln's chances for re-election. Here, 1900 map. This is McKinley, Republican, and Bryan, Democratic. You can see what was then the solid Democratic South, and some of these newly admitted Western states in blue, because Bryan was running on what was then a populist platform at the time. McKinley was running for the Northeast industrial and so on. Okay, those are the first 4 levers through the 19th century that Congress was playing an active role in. Who counts, the formula, the size of the House, and the admission of states. States were doing redistricting, and that is their charge, the legislatures in the Constitution. But it does say that Congress may at any time make or alter such regulations. Now, Congress in the 19th century often told with each one of these apportionment laws, states make your districts compact, contiguous, and equal, but there was no enforcement. So states could and did malapportion unequal sized districts, and they could gerrymander, and they did, which is again to draw to advantage a party where even if it's equal and the districts may or may not be odd shaped, many of them are, but they certainly don't have to be. Some states in the 19th century never redistricted. That means you are automatically malapportioning as your population, if you have any population growth at all or movement from rural areas to the cities. Some states, on the other hand, redistricted all the time, not just once every 10 years. And there was malapportionment as a deliberate strategy of parties. And there was also gerrymandering. And the gerrymandering in the 19th century, if a party felt it could get an edge, it was happy to toss out an incumbent. People did not expect to have long congressional careers. That's quite different from today. And the House, the US House, changed control, different parties, But what was really mattering in the country was the urban-rural divide. Okay, this is different color scheme here. This is not not who won which state, but how many seats did different states have in 1913 after the 1910 census? And the powerhouses were New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, then Massachusetts, Missouri, Texas. California was just middle rank then. Florida was barely out of the, just had a handful of seats. And there were some states, the mauve, that just had one, and Alaska and Hawaii weren't yet in the Union. I pick out this date because a big thing happened in 1920. That census was taken following the influenza pandemic, and it showed that we were a majority urban population with a lot of immigrants. And areas that would lose seats did not like these results. Congress was also fighting over the formula, but for the first and so far only time in our history, Congress did not reapportion the House. They just didn't do anything. Finally, they passed a 1929 law that provides for the automatic process that we have now, where the Census Bureau uses the approved formula, which is Huntington Hill, runs the numbers, hands the 50 state numbers to the president, who's supposed to just pass them right on to the clerk of the House, who then tells the states what is their number of seats. And this is all to be done in January when Congress is not in session. The idea is to minimize the chance of any argument about it. But what about these areas that didn't like this majority urban population here? The trade-off was that Congress and the courts totally stayed out of state redistricting. And the malapportionment, both in the US House and the state legislatures, was extreme. New York State, for instance, had one district in New York City that had 800,000 people in it, and an upstate district that had only 90,000. This is a hugely unequal representation. And on average, across all the states, there was 15 to 20% difference in population size. And many states never redistricted again. So whichever party, rural interests were heavily, heavily favored. So there were folks, of course, who did not like this and they fought it, but the courts were no help. And a famous case in 1946, Justice Felix Frankfurter said that the federal judiciary had no power to correct these malapportioned districts. This was a political thicket, which the courts shouldn't get into. The Warren Court, totally rightly, I think in everybody's perspective, said that this was just not government, of the people, by the people, for the people, when you had these wildly disparate population size districts. So they said one person, one vote, and districts had to be equal population in both the US House and state legislatures. And then the 65 Voting Rights Act also said that all sorts of things, including districting, could not discriminate against minorities. Well, the population deviation between largest and smallest districts plummeted after the 70 census. Districts are now as equal as you can make them in population size. And we had what became a redistricting industry. Census small area data, voting registration data, computers, to meet the legal criteria and still advantage a party. And in fact, firms don't work across party aisles. There are firms that do Republican districting and firms that do Democratic. Okay, during this period, power was shifting across the country due to the census for reapportionment. Here, the colors represent not red and blue, the Republican Democrat, but red is loss of seats and green is gain. Our powerhouses from 100 years ago, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, lost a lot of seats. California, Texas, Florida were the big big gainers. Some states did not change, the pink ones there. During this period, when this reapportionment was going on, both parties gerrymandered. They cracked, they split up their opposition's voters, as in Austin, Texas. Sometimes they packed their opposition voters into as few districts as possible. Now, there wasn't actually much consequence during this period because many legislatures were not controlled by one party. One party might have their Senate, one party might have their House, so they had to compromise. Also, the Supreme Court did say no to disadvantaging minorities. And there was a big increase in people of color in Congress and what are called majority-minority districts. But leading up to 2010 census, the Republicans acted very strategically to concentrate on capturing many more state houses. And they then gerrymandered Congress and those states just really to end all and be all. It was really massive gerrymandering. This graph shows what happened. Look at 2000 on the left side. The red bar, this is the number of states and who controls them, and therefore who controls redistricting. There were 7 or 8 states that were totally controlled by the Republicans. That's the red bar there. Blue bar is Democrats. There were more of those in 2000, and there were a lot of split states. That's the orangish. The gold is states that only have 1 seat, so they can't, they can gerrymander their House maybe, but not Congress. And the olive means there is some sort of independent commission doing the redistricting. Well, in 2010, that red bar jumped, it about tripled of Republican control of state legislatures. The blue bar dropped and the split dropped. In 2020, where we are right now, the Republicans even have one more state that they control totally. Democrats look like they gained 1. A big gain, but not still all that many states, is in independent commissions. Although some of them are truly nonpartisan and some of them are set up like mini legislatures where they fight among the Republican appointees and the Democratic appointees. But anyway, in 2020, Republicans went into redistricting with many more seats under their control than Democrats. Now, the gerrymandering that happened in 2010, it's estimated that in the subsequent 3 elections, 2012, 14, and 16, although Democrats had some gerrymandering too, Republicans had a lot more, and that they gained an average of 19 seats per election. That's a huge amount. Gerrymandering, of course, is not destiny. The voters can rise up and change their usual voting patterns. And what you can see in the graph, the blue line is the Democratic share of the nationwide popular vote for the US House. And in 2012, 14, 16, that was higher than the red line, which is how many seats they had, the proportion of seats. 2018, there was voters rising up against Trump folks, basically, and the Democrats got a share of seats that was in line with their popular vote share, and they have retained control, but by a much slimmer margin. Just for your information, the biggest Democratic gerrymandering state, they're not necessarily that big in population, but the one that has consistently done it the most is our neighbor Maryland for Democrats. For Republicans, a number of states have had a history of this: Alabama, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Virginia, until the Democrats took control in Wisconsin. And not only are they gerrymandering the US House, but they're gerrymandering their state legislatures so that in some of these states, Republicans or Democrats are staying in power, even though, or they have outsized majorities, even though the popular vote doesn't follow that. Now, People are not been happy with the current gerrymandering, which is very extreme in our history. And academics have constructed metrics for how you might measure extreme partisan gerrymandering, but the Supreme Court has bowed out. First, in 2013, it gutted the provision of the Voting Rights Act that allowed the US Department of Justice to what they called pre-clear plans in states that had a history of discrimination. You had to submit your plan, whether it was something to make voting tougher or gerrymandering or whatever, and the feds could knock you down and make you go back to the drawing board. That was gutted. That can no longer happen. In 2018, the whole court expressed befuddlement at how some of these metrics work. And in 2019, a divided court said, just like Frankfurters said back in the 40s, the federal courts have no power to police partisan gerrymandering. And what had happened was the Maryland Democratic gerrymandering and the North Carolina Republican gerrymandering had been appealed to federal courts, and the federal district courts had said, boy, this is truly extreme partisan gerrymandering. But the Supreme Court said, that is none of our business, and those gerrymandered maps stood. Okay, we are finally up to what is happening now. The 2020 redistricting cycle. We had delays. It's happening now. It's not already done because there were delays in the census due to COVID and other things impeding the enumeration. There was attempted political interference by the Trump administration that almost succeeded. They wanted census to exclude undocumented immigrants from the apportionment counts. This is very hard to do with any accuracy, and census pushed back, but there have been groups that are opposed to immigration who have brought lawsuits since 1980 to say that undocumented immigrants should not count for reapportionment and redistricting. The administration also wanted the Census Bureau to get estimates of the citizen voting age population. Remember, they tried to get a question on the census and they didn't get that, but they tasked the Census Bureau to use administrative records and come up with citizen voting age population. And several Republican states were planning to use that for redistricting, which would disadvantage areas of their state with immigrants and also lots of kids. Fortunately for the country, the clock ran out. And Trump was gone before any of this could happen or any big battle about it. And we really owe the Census Bureau professional staff a profound gratitude for not only taking a reasonably good census under daunting circumstances, but when they finished the field work and they were under pressure to end it early, they took a look at the data and said there's some situations, like how college students are counted, that we have to take care of before we can release anything. And they stuck to that. They did not meet the statutory deadlines, but they did the best job they could. And they released the 50 state apportionment counts in this last April and the redistricting in August. So states have been scrambling. Well, now, how good is this census? It's actually pretty good. Again, a lot of credit due to the Census Bureau. The estimate is that there was likely about 0.5% net undercount. Every census misses some people and double counts others, but this census looked like it did pretty well. Preliminary analysis does suggest that there was a greater undercount than in 2010 of African Americans, Hispanics, kids, non-citizens, but it is still reasonably good, certainly for apportionment and most likely for most redistricting, and it's what's available. And again, the number they came up with was not like, shockingly low or anything. It appears to be about on target. I personally think this is a tale of two censuses, that there was improved quality in better off areas with broadband, everybody sat right down at their computer and sent off their form, and poorer quality in less well-off areas, in internet poor areas, which can be either rural because they don't have the infrastructure in the first place, or urban, they can't afford FiOS or or anybody else or whatever. So I think when we get the chance, and at my unit at the National Academies of Sciences, we're doing a study right this minute that's going to be looking in more depth at the quality of the census, we'll find some of these patterns. But the redistricting has to go on, and it is. Here's what the apportionment was in 2020. We find our states that have been losing power continued. New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, West Virginia, each lost a seat, and also California, first time in its history, lost a seat. Texas gained 2, Florida, North Carolina, Colorado, Montana, and Oregon each gained 1. Here is a map of the control of the redistricting, puts in map form what I showed you before in a bar graph. All of that red are states that Republicans control the entire legislature. The small number of blue states are Democratic controlled. The gold states only have 1 seat, so they're not part of the action. And the sort of brownish, pinkish, whatever, are orangish, are states where the legislature is split. And olive is where there is some kind of a independent commission. Going into the redistricting, Republicans started with an advantage with the solid and the leaning of 208 seats to the Democrats 181, and only 46 competitive seats going in that we've had over this last decade, as estimated by folks who look at this. So what is happening in terms of 2020 maps? Well, remember, 6 states only have 1 seat, so they're already done without having to do anything. 26 states have finalized their map, although the Ohio Supreme Court just struck down the heavily Republican map for that state. And because of that US Supreme Court decision, the Republicans cannot appeal to the federal court, so they're going to have to work that out. Thus far, redistricting has created 7 more Democratic leaning seats, but most of those are already held by Democrats, 1 more Republican leaning seat, and 6 fewer highly competitive seats, which is really the shame in my view. We have so few competitive seats. The North Carolina map, which is having gerrymandered, but also racial gerrymandered. And on the Democratic side, the Illinois map is really, really gerrymandered in favor of the Democrats. So my bottom line, democracy, it's one, unfortunately, it is one of many, many threats, a number of which I have not talked about at all because they don't relate to the sitting rules and who counts the votes. Gerrymandering has always existed in our history, and both parties do it. Historically, admission of states was just as problematic and has left us with this built-in rural malapportionment. In 1910 to 1970, the malapportionment form of districting drastically favored rural areas in the states and in the Congress. And the Warren Court rightly stepped in and said this was just wrong. 70 to 2000, the computerized gerrymandering, all this work that these redistrictors do, didn't make that much difference because so many states had split party control. And the courts also did oversee and disallow blatant racial gerrymandering. In 2010, the Republicans had worked hard to capture those state legislatures, and then they just gerrymandered to the greatest extent, both the states and their seats in the House. It is difficult for courts or anybody to define what is extreme gerrymandering from just kind of at the edges. But I really think that the Supreme Court should rethink its position. I don't think it's likely to anytime soon, but it would be great if it did. And Congress can and should help by requiring compactness, contiguity, nonpartisan commissions, and restoration of the Voting Rights Act. And that all these things are in, others are in the two bills that our House has passed, and we're having debate in the Senate, but it's not going to go anywhere. This can be very depressing, actually, when one is in the middle of this history, but we all have, as individual citizens, some time, some energy, some money, and there are groups that are working to rectify these undemocratic features of our system and to elect candidates who will, like in state houses, go for truly independent, nonpartisan commissions and make other changes that will bring us closer to government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to questions either now or later. I'm at ccitro@nas.edu. The 538 site has a very good redistricting tracker if you want to keep up to date on what's happening. And again, thank you so much. And I believe I may stop screen sharing.
Well, thank you, Connie. That was absolutely wonderful. And I just know we've got lots of questions out here I don't see one in the chat. So raise your hands and.
There's two screens.
Okay, so looks like Diane Shagus has got a question. Unmute yourself, Diane, please. I know.
Connie, I was just wondering if there are any other states where the courts would step in like they did in Ohio. The state court.
Yeah, there are several states that are under litigation, quote unquote, right now. I would have to look up in 538 to tell you which ones they are, but there are people out there on either side who have lawyered up and who are ready to fight some of these things. So yes, North Carolina right now is certainly going to go up to its state Supreme Court, and there are some other states that will as well. What happened in Ohio was the voters said they voted on a ballot initiative. They actually set up a commission for the state legislature, and for the House, they left it with their state legislature instead of a commission for the US House, but they expressed the sentiment that things should not be gerrymandered. And that's what the court relied on when it struck down that the Republican legislature's attempt at the redistricting.
Connie, Holly Heater wants to know what are the best organizations to support?
That's a good question. And there is, Eric Holder has a group that has been working on this. The Brennan Center for Justice keeps track of a lot of this. I'd be happy to, I didn't sort of research that. Stacey Abrams, of course, in Georgia, but she has a national group. If you go to the Brennan Center, that is the best place really to get materials on who is doing what to fight what. And they have taken gerrymandering and redistricting as one of their areas that they work
on. I'm sorry, I have lost a picture right now. So Mary, can you help me out? Who has a hand up?
Carol Grodson does.
Yeah.
It returned to me.
So much that was really helpful in understanding. Could you more directly explain the direct connection between the census and all of this with the Electoral College? And might it be more possible to affect the whole system of the Electoral College than to get involved in each state and the gerrymandering problems and the Electoral College designation?
Yes, the census, as the census provides the numbers for each state's numbers of seats in the US House, and then also the data that the states use to redistrict to get equal size and do whatever else they want. That means the Electoral College, California has one fewer Electoral College votes as of the 2020 census. There is an effort among a number of states to pass laws that would say the state would have its electors cast their ballots for whoever wins the national, actual popular vote nationwide. And if enough states were to pass such legislation, the Electoral College would be rendered irrelevant because it would be the national vote that would matter. But they've kind of run up against the states that would already favor that, which are mostly our Democratic states have already passed that, and states that would not favor that, because again, the Electoral College, because of having 2 senators for every state, regardless of size, plus the House number of seats, is again, and because we have so many people per House seat, if we had a House that say was twice as big, be kind of hard to contemplate, but the UK House of Commons is about 600 people, not 435. Then again, more populous state would have more power in the Electoral College. So right now, the fact that we have relatively few House seats and we have 2 senators per state means that again, small, and there are more small rural Republican states right now than there are small urban Democratic states. They have an outside advantage. So those states don't want to sign this compact to make the Electoral College moot. And otherwise it would take an amendment to the Constitution. And that's very difficult.
Thank you.
I think, sure. I think there's a question up here.
Yeah, Bill,
Howard?
Bill Cruzy has a question.
Hi. I know a little bit about this, the reform movements. My brother-in-law, who's Ming's brother, was on the independent commission in California that really took on gerrymandering and did a great job because it was immediately attacked by losers who were Republicans. Back in the bad old days, the Democrats and the Republicans in California had this unholy alliance. Under the California Constitution, if a supermajority approved state redistricting, then it didn't go to, then the voters had nothing to say. So the Democrats, who had the majority, but not supermajority, worked out a deal with the Republicans whereby the Republicans got more seats than they were entitled to, so long as they would work with the Democrats for the supermajority. So after this independent commission did its work, overall the Republicans lost seats, but so did certain Democrats. They, the way it was set up in San Francisco was that people who lived in the suburbs had a San Franciscan congressperson. So as a result of the reform, the suburbs got more congressmen, even though they were still Democrats, they weren't the same ones. The leader in this movement was, I believe it was Arizona. And then there's some great stories about how a young woman led the charge in Michigan to get an independent commission. And then there were a couple other Midwestern states. New York State passed a constitutional amendment calling for an independent commission. However, it left the final authority with the legislature. Now,
Yes,
to
there
be-
are independent,
happens in New
sorry.
York because they've lost one seat because of 84 people who weren't there, including my wife and I, who are domiciled in New York, but we were in DC when we filled out the census report. Anyway, my wife is yelling at me. It's going to be interesting what happens to Elise Stefanik, who has sold
Yes.
her soul. She's worse than Benedict Arnold as far as I'm concerned, but she could be gerrymandered out. And I don't think anybody would be very upset if that happened. And that's all I'm going to say.
Okay. Other questions or comments? I'm gonna go.
But thank you
over-
for that, because again, there are commissions and commissions. The California one is a really good model. Many others are set up where each party appoints so many people and they tend to deteriorate into, fights and so on. And that's what happened in Virginia. I think the courts took over there, but there are models of how to set this up. And it would really, really help our democracy a lot, including so that the general election counted as opposed to primaries.
Mhm. Other comments, questions? I'm going back and forth. I don't see hands. Well, if there are no more comments or questions, then thank you, Connie, for an absolutely wonderful, wonderful presentation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And do join us next month, February 7th, when Robin Hinson Jones is going to talk about, if you'll let me be a little flippant, how we got from a State Department that was pale, male, and Yale to a diverse State Department representing the United States. So see you all on February 7th. And once again, Connie, terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Don't hesitate to contact me, etc. This was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank
Maybe.